Well, wouldn't you know it, Steam Deck 2 leaks, rumors, and speculation are back, almost like they never left. And listen, I've got to be honest, I have a bone to pick with these alleged leaks, or at least the outlets that are covering them. You know, I don't consider myself a journalist, so I have to admit I got more than a little annoyed at some point when I realized I think I'm doing more work trying to get the facts straight than the actual journalistic outlets. Let me explain. Moore's Law is Dead is a YouTube channel that regularly reports on leaks related to gaming hardware, especially at the CPU and GPU level. Tom, who runs the Moore's Law is Dead channel, has a podcast on the channel called Broken Silicon. In the latest episode of Broken Silicon, Tom was joined by my good friend Jimmy Champagne, who runs Deck Ready and PS Ready, and in this episode they were pretty much just shooting the shit, talking about what they'd like to see or what they think they will see from a Steam Deck 2, a PlayStation handheld, or a Steam home console, or the ROG Xbox Ally. It was mostly just two passionate bros speculating and having a good time. But if you were to look at the news articles in the last few days, you would get the impression that they not only leaked the Steam Deck 2 and Steam home console, but also what was powering these devices, not to mention a secret partnership with Sony that benefits both Sony and Valve. But also, if you look at any of those news articles, you might notice that none of them provide any direct quotes or timestamps, and that is something I should have called into sooner, but I didn't. Because, man, I listened to this 90-minute podcast several times to try to find citations for what these news outlets were reporting on, and finally I had to admit, maybe nobody is reporting on this accurately. Notebookcheck.net was one of the first outlets to report on this, and then Tom's Guide, PC Guide, and Kotaku all reported on what Notebook Check said. Yes, they were copying Notebook Check's homework rather than what was actually said. And possibly the first sign of this is that Notebook Check spelled Jimmy's name wrong, and subsequently they all did. And so here's the part of the Notebook Check article that is making the rounds. The reporter says, quote, according to podcast host Tom from Moore's Law is Dead, internal leaks suggest Valve is working on a next generation device with significantly more power, possibly based on AMD's upcoming Zen 6 based Magnus APU, which could also be powering the next-gen consoles from Sony or Microsoft, end quote. The thing I find so difficult about this excerpt is that the words are not necessarily objectively false if you give it the most generous interpretation you possibly could, but it's worded in a way that I find to be misleading, and I don't know how to explain that other than to break it up into two halves. Let's start with where they say internal leaks suggest Valve is working on a next-generation device with significantly more power. Throughout the podcast, Tom and Jimmy talk about the Steam Deck 2 as sort of a foregone conclusion. There's not a point in the podcast where either of them feel compelled to say, I heard Valve is working on a Steam Deck 2, because that is pretty much a given at this point, just like it's a given that Sony is working on a PS6. Valve has said that they're going to follow up the Steam Deck with the next generation of handheld, but only when the time is right. So you pretty much have to assume that they're going to be working on the Steam Deck 2 all the way up until it's actually in our hands. I suppose, however, the other way you could read this is that next generation device refers not to a Steam Deck 2, but instead a Steam home console, despite the fact that Notebook Check leads with Steam Deck 2 in the title and in the intro of this piece, not to mention that the words next generation imply being a successor, which would again point more to a Steam Deck 2 than a Steam home console, but fine, let's go with it. With regard to a home console, there are two instances in the episode where Tom does make a point to say what he's heard about a potential Steam home console. At about 36 minutes in, he says, quote, if Valve announces a Steam Deck 2 and a Steam home console, which from what I'm hearing, they might be working on something quite powerful, then, and I'll paraphrase this last part, but he says, then the Battlefield 6 devs might say we need to support this so that we get our players on there, end quote. The point he was making is that it would be nice if a Steam home console gets so much traction that developers feel compelled to support it. In that instance, it's pretty clear that he's referring to a potential Steam home console, not the Steam Deck 2, when he says, from what I'm hearing, they might be working on something quite powerful. Even that sentence is very much in passing, and he doesn't attribute it to any particular source of any kind. Then, later on in the video, at about 1 hour and 16 minutes, Tom once again refers to the rumored Steam home console and says, quote, all I can say is I was told honestly a couple years ago, like full stop, they're using AMD. It's going to be really powerful and they're going to treat this like a proper console launch. This isn't going to be some little project, end quote. So here, once again, is where he makes a point to say that a Steam home console would be really, really powerful. Returning to the Steam Deck 2, but sticking to the part of the excerpt where they say significantly more power, I suppose you could also say that Tom does suggest the Steam Deck 2 will be more powerful, but he illustrates that by saying, quote, if they made a Steam Deck built for what's in the Ally X right now and it ran SteamOS and it was optimized for it, I think any game you're running 40 frames is now 120 at the same resolution, just like that, end quote. I guess the point I'm making is that what Tom states here, aside from the specifics around frame rate, which do sound impressive, is obvious and not newsworthy. He's essentially saying that Steam Deck 2 will be more powerful than Steam Deck just by virtue of the fact that handhelds being released this year are more powerful than the Steam Deck. Then there's the second half of the excerpt where it says that this next generation device, whichever one they're referring to, is, quote, possibly based on AMD's upcoming Zen 6 based Magnus APU, which could also be powering the next gen consoles from Sony or Microsoft, end quote. I don't know. Am I being pranked right now? Because that is not exactly what was said on the podcast. Once again, Tom mentions Magnus at 2 points in the interview. I'll start with the second time because it contains a crucial detail. At 43 minutes in, he says,
I leaked something called Magnus that has 11 cores and seemingly a graphics portion that's as powerful as a high-end graphics card.
The crucial detail is that Tom leaked the existence of Magnus in a previous video where he also says that Magnus is not slated for desktops or laptops, meaning that the likely customer is some dedicated games hardware. In that previous video, he suggests perhaps a PS6, and in a more recent video, he says that it is for a next-gen Xbox console. The other time Tom mentions Magnus at about 26 minutes in.
I leaked something called Zen 6 Magnus, which to me seems like it's either the next gen Xbox or PlayStation, or who knows, maybe a next gen Valve consoles. It's one of those three. So maybe
the way he describes this lines up with his other videos. Magnus is likely meant for some gaming hardware, and in terms of likelihood, next gen PlayStation was likely, next gen Xbox was likely. Then maybe a Valve console could be the third most likely. That to me is extremely different than the way Notebook Check phrased it when they said this highlighted portion. I'm not going to repeat it, but you can pause here and read it. Let me know if you agree or disagree, because this is just driving me nuts. Anyway, as an aside, I checked in with Tom and he pointed me to his latest video and the pinned comment therein, where he does say that Magnus is confirmed by his internal sources to definitely be for a next-gen Xbox. Here is a screenshot from that video where he details other code names and likelihoods of which he says he's very sure of as well. Based on my DM with Tom, his personal feeling is that unless Valve is using something more off the shelf, he just doesn't think they're rushed to replace the Steam Deck, which I think lines up with everything we've heard from Valve's mouths themselves. By the way, that is what real reporting looks like, reaching out to the source and if possible getting direct quotes. I'm starting to feel like Super Hot Fire, you know, the dude that's like, I'm not a rapper and then proceeds to drop the best bars known to man. I am not a journalist, guys, but please do better. And it's not just notebookcheck.com either. In fact, everyone else is maybe even more guilty, because from here, Tom's guide reported on what Notebook Check said Tom said. And I wish I was kidding when I say after that, Kotaku reported on what Tom's guide said, Notebook Check said that Tom said. This to me is not reporting. I would love a Steam Deck 2. I would love some Steam Deck 2 news, but this is just out of hand. Let me know what you think. Am I going crazy, or are y'all with me? Let me know in the comments. Thank you. Speaking of things getting wild in the news, we've got to talk about more games being taken down, this time on itch.io, or as I like to call it, itch.io. Itch.io is an awesome digital game platform that specializes in indie games, and it turns out that they had to de-index all their adult, not safe for work content from their browse and search pages. Essentially, the games and the game pages still exist, but this results in them no longer being discoverable on the store. They are doing this while they evaluate each and every single game to see which ones need to be removed altogether in order to appease the payment processors like PayPal and MasterCard, who are putting the squeeze on Itch.io, just like they did to Valve last week when Valve was forced to take down a number of explicit adult-themed games on their own Steam store. This started with an NGO by the name of Collective Shout when they began a campaign and wrote an open letter to CEOs of payment processors demanding that those processors stop handling payments for gaming platforms that host certain types of games. I'm just going to let you see it on screen. Itch.io wrote a long post saying flat out, quote, "Our ability to process payments is critical for every creator on our platform. To ensure that we can continue to operate and provide a marketplace for all developers, we must prioritize our relationship with our payment partners and take immediate steps towards compliance." As a result, Itch.io had to act fast to stay in business, and so this is the route that they're taking. Collective Shout has a long history, including attempting to block Snoop Dogg and Eminem from performing in Australia and successfully blocking Tyler, the Creator, from performing in Australia. They also attempted to take down Detroit Become Human, and recently they were responsible for successfully taking down a game called No Mercy. Interestingly, the open letter is dated July 10th, published publicly on July 11th, with Valve responding by removing games in question by July 15th. That is 4 business days from writing an open letter to payment processors to games getting taken down on one of the biggest storefronts, if not the biggest storefront in gaming. It speaks to an unexpected amount of power, not just in payment processors, but in the communities that have organized to pressure the payment processors that in turn have pressured Valve and now Itch.io. Interestingly, as pointed out by 80 Level, Yoko Taro warned about this back in 2024 in response to the shutdown of a manga archive, again due to credit card companies refusing to process payments. Yoko Taro said this, quote, "While regulations exceeding the law have been applied to publishing and other areas, it feels like a different level of danger when payment processors, which are tied to the entire distribution infrastructure, can make such decisions on their own. If payment processors are controllers, it could even be used in speech control in other countries. It's not just about adult content regulations or freedom of expression. It feels like there is a security hole affecting democracy as a whole." Wise words from a visionary. Thank you, Toro-san. I personally have criticized Valve in the past for not having a more hands-on approach to content moderation, but certainly this does not feel like the way forward. What do you think? So it looks like a young college student by the name of Zalkar Saliev won the Gabe Newell interview lottery because he was granted an over 30-minute interview with the Valve visionary where Gabe provided some history and his thoughts on a variety of topics. When asked how he managed to score the interview, Zalkar said in the comments, "Honestly, I think the vision behind the interview resonated. It was part of a bigger project I'm doing about legends in tech and their advice for the next generation. Grateful he took a chance on it." Listen, Zalkar, we are all grateful that you asked Gabe for an interview and that he granted that interview to you. Clearly, Gabe and Zalkar both are legends for this one. Now, given the context of Zalkar not being a professional YouTuber, the audio for the interview is pretty rough, but thankfully there are some diamonds in the rough and I listened to the entire interview. So here's some of them. First of all, Gabe Newell said he began programming in high school and usually he was programming when he was not doing the work he was supposed to be doing. He was planning on being a doctor, and so programming was really a distraction from his own medical studies. Likewise, Gabe himself would come to Microsoft offices to distract his brother, who was working for the tech giant at the time, until Steve Ballmer told him, if you're going to be here, you've got to be productive, and so Gabe ended up working at Microsoft too. He said that at the time, Microsoft wasn't anywhere near the powerhouse they are today. He illustrated that by saying that Microsoft was the 3rd biggest tech company, not in the world, in the suburbs of Seattle. That is just insane to think about. In any case, throughout his time at Microsoft, he challenged the status quo, first by porting Doom to Windows 95 and making it performant when others thought that impossible, and then by leaving Microsoft to start Valve when he saw that id's distribution model with Doom outperformed Microsoft's traditional models of selling games. Probably the most poignant part of the interview is when he gives advice that is once again against the grain of modern tech companies. His core advice is to relentlessly focus on creating value for customers, because capital is going to naturally follow, and distractions like chasing VC funding prematurely are just going to be detrimental to the overall goal. Interestingly, he also emphasizes how important AI will be to all of our jobs, saying that understanding both the technical underpinnings and practical application of AI tools is crucial, going as far as to say that even pure AI tool users will gain significant advantages over those that are not leveraging AI in their day-to-day jobs. To wit, he believes that in filmmaking alone, the impact of AI will be 10 times as significant as the impact of CGI. On a personal note, he describes his daily routine as working 7 days a week, often combined with scuba diving. He also emphasizes that his intense work doesn't really feel like work because he genuinely enjoys it. But he does make a point to note that he's not exclusively working on Valve. In fact, Valve may take a backseat to two of his other ventures, Inkfish and Starfish Neuroscience. Inkfish is a marine research organization that owns several ships and submersibles for deep sea exploration, and Starfish is a neuroscience company that is currently developing neural interfaces. So clearly, Gabe is a pretty busy guy. Overall, I found this to be extremely insightful, and I'm super happy to see someone like Gabe take the time out of his day to do an interview like this one. Good on both of them for making this happen. Thanks, guys. By the way, have you noticed that there is a new Steam Store UI, at least for users on the Steam client beta? The new UI is pretty different now, with the sidebar of links on the left being completely gone. Search is much improved and easier to get to, and the top bar has been revamped to be a lot easier to navigate on a Steam Deck or with a controller. This is a really nice update so far, and it is continuing with Valve's efforts for a more consistent looking UI that is easier to navigate with a control pad. Always good stuff. All right, that's going to do it for this week. I hope you're having a wonderful week. That gang out. Goodbye.